Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Stef.
No.
Yes?
So tired of that sing-song, hi, Sarah. Okay. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Stef.
I was trying to change the tone of my voice. Okay. We're talking today about being greedy. This word comes up all the time for people in the way people describe themselves with food.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because I know you did a YouTube video on this last week.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some interesting thoughts that arose as a result of it. Would you like to share?
Absolutely. I had one of those weeks where this word was coming up everywhere in sessions, in questions that people were sending to me. And the way that people were using it, they were grappling with this idea. Do I actually have a problem with food? Do I actually struggle with disordered eating? Is this a valid problem? Or am I just greedy? Am I just somebody who just overeats? And I think this, especially for the massive range of people that do not meet the clinical criteria for an eating disorder, or perhaps just don't identify as having an eating disorder, but struggle with food, it's really hard to find your place. Well, what is it? What is this problem? How much of it is my responsibility? How much of it is beyond my control? And I think people move in and out of that. And I definitely experienced this. I don't know that I was necessarily using the word greedy, but I definitely, particularly when I was semi-recovered and binging sometimes and then being okay sometimes, I felt like at that point I should be able to do better. Like at that point, how can it be disordered eating if sometimes I seem to be okay and sometimes I'm not? Surely it's my fault if I'm not feeling balanced with food. And then, of course, there's so much judgment around this idea of being greedy and what it means. So I had to go into dictionary definitions. I've been looking at this word a lot, but what does the word mean to you? If someone says, I'm greedy, what does that word mean?
So there's something so strongly associated with this word and being too much, like needing too much, wanting too much, being excessive. And when I hear people describe themselves as just being greedy or question if that's just their fundamental nature, there's some also sense of insecurity about being too much and feeling too much. And for me, I felt this way because I felt like my feelings were too much. I felt like I was too much, that if people could see the extent of my thoughts and my depth of emotion to things that, didn't seem to deserve the response of that emotion, that they would see that I, in fact, was too much. And I harbored a lot of insecurity about that. And I think that is easily translated to food, because food is one place where some of this shows up because our life and our plate, but also that it's such a concrete way of expressing needs and of feeling like if you let me have some, I would just want more and more and more. And where else might that be true in your life? Where else do you feel that about yourself in general? What messages have you received that confirm that?
I think I was surprised when I looked it up because I thought it was going to be about having too much. And it's not. It's about pretty much what you were saying there. It's about wanting more than you need. Yeah. Who doesn't want more than they need, right? How many of us are so pious that in life, all we want is exactly what we need and no more? I think the human condition is to want, but it's that judgment of just the desire itself, even beyond whether you act on it or not.
But I think that it's also really related to scarcity. So I think that the more scarce something is, the more we want it, and the more we want to make up for the thought of not having it, and that will increase one's quote unquote greed. And I think we look at this as greed, not understanding that what it's coming from is a defense. It's a security measure. It's a protection against not having enough. If at one time we felt that we didn't have enough. And even as I'm, speaking about emotions, I felt I'm going to use myself. I felt at one time that I didn't have access to enough validation and enough comfort, essentially, and feeling like when you come from a place of feeling like there isn't enough and food, I mean, that's what dieting is. And when your body or your mind or your heart or your soul know that there's not enough of something that you need as a human, it sets up a knowledge of that inside that will defend then against, okay, well, we need to then collect as much as we can. And that becomes the impetus for moving through the world, is to know that we have enough, and coming from this feeling of that there isn't enough. There's a belief that develops that we don't have enough, or that there is potentially not going to be enough access. And I
Mhm,
think that we interpret this as a character flaw when in fact it's a human defense.
mhm. And it hurts, doesn't it, to want something that we believe either we couldn't have or we shouldn't want? Well, from the moral perspective and the scarcity part, greed is normally associated, not always, it can be anything, but usually around money and food. Those are both things that are very much moralized in a lot of religious teachings. And also money is one of those things that grows over time. So 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there was less money than there is now. There was less food than there is now. Way back when the moralization of this really took root, I imagine that someone wanting more than their share probably did mean that someone else went without.
Mm.
And that's not true for most people in the cultures that most people listening to this are existing in. That you, whether you binge or not, is not going to make somebody else go hungry. But there was a time when that was probably true. If you ate more than your share, that meant there wasn't enough for someone else. That's the scarcity element as well. But that has then taken root and then all tied up with this idea of self-control and altruism.
What do you mean by altruism? I mean, I know what altruism means, but how are you relating that back to this?
That this is about thinking of other people. So if you are greedy, you are being selfish and you're not thinking of other people. That may be true to some degree if you having what you want means that someone else is going to suffer.
Mm.
That
Do you
the
think
out
that
yeah.
No, I mean, do you think that people who associate themselves with being greedy with food are thinking in that vein?
No, but I think that's where this word took root in culture
Okay.
and even in a generational aspect as well. So nowadays we're talking a lot more about mental health. We have wider means of communication and diverse voices just accessible for people. The number of people who've told me that their parents or people of a different generation, an older generation to themselves, really don't get it. Richard Osman, the presenter in the UK who spoke out about his struggles with food, there were people saying, no, he's just greedy. What's he talking about?
Mm.
And those words were actually used. That, I think, is where it comes from in terms of how language develops over time and how the real moral part, because greed just means wanting more than you need.
Yeah.
But that was much worse back then than it is now in terms of the impact on other people, which I think is what I meant by altruistic and caring about other people having enough.
Well, I think it also calls into question, like, who determines what we need? Like, who decided that we needed the bare minimum? And who makes the moral judgments around how much um, is enough? And I think when we're talking about today's culture and diet culture, there's definitely this idea that the bare minimum is all you should need. And that if you need more than that, if you need more than the RDA, not even that, but like the prescribed caloric diet equivalents, that if you need more than that, then you're greedy. And can we question what a quote unquote, how much we need, what that really means? And
Mhm.
does that have a faulty definition to begin with, let alone, um, going above and beyond that?
Well, when food is actually scarce, what we need might be what we need to survive. But in a time of more abundance of food availability, it might be what do we need to thrive
Mm.
from a holistic point of view, from our well-being, from our emotional,
Yeah.
mental, social, physical, all of it.
Or what do we need to feel safe? I think that's a different, I mean, even with the pandemic, right? And the mass exodus to go get to Costco's to get toilet paper and paper towels. Not that we needed that amount in that moment, but there was a feeling of needing, because there was a threat to safety of being able to have access in the future. And I think
Mhm,
these are, I mean, and you could say that there was an uptick in greed and that we got greedy over toilet paper, but to be able to see it as there's a psychological reasoning behind that that something is happening, and the same would go with food, that if we felt or had a feeling that there might be scarcity in the future, or that because there is a memory of that in the past or an awareness of the threat of it, that there is a human desire to go collect as much as one can to preserve this sense of feeling like I'm safe. And that isn't something necessarily coming from your higher thinking of greed. It's not a greed based concept. This is a security based concept.
I think it also calls into the legitimacy of this as a problem, because often the question is this actually a problem, or am I just insert whatever judgment it is that you're having about yourself? I think there is an enormous amount of relief for people when they hear about binge eating being a thing, diets don't work, all of these kinds of messages that are getting out there. People finally feel seen, they finally feel heard, they're like, oh, okay, it's actually a thing. Then they start learning more about it. And as time goes on, there can be those dips where actually maybe I'm the imposter here. Maybe everybody else actually does have a problem with this, but I'm the one who doesn't. And yet I'm here convincing myself that I do because I'm just making excuses for myself. That, I think, is a very common narrative for people in this space, is to actually feel like an imposter.
Yeah. Well, what belief system would give rise to believing that you're an imposter? What evidence do we have that would say that yes, in fact, you don't have a disorder? What defines that, having a disorder versus just being greedy? What does it mean to just be greedy? What is that? Where is it coming from?
Well, I think that is the judgment that people put upon themselves, that it's some kind of moral failing, that it's not a problem, I'm somehow the problem. The real judgment for their own emotions and their desires, and a little bit like that idea of how much easier it is to give compassion to someone else than it is to give it for ourselves. And you said something on the episode, which is lovely, and I have quoted you a couple of times, was saying one of the reasons perhaps why it's hard to have compassion for ourselves, or even hard to see this as a legitimate problem, is because you said we know those dark corners, like those moments where perhaps it did feel like a choice to eat something and we ate it anyway, or the doubt about, oh, I could have
Mm,
stopped at this point, or I could have done this, or I know that if I did this thing that might support me and I didn't do it.
mm.
It's those stories, I think, that hold people in that place.
Well, you know what I find frees people from those stories is knowing that there's a reason. And when someone can explain, I know that when even in talking about the reason why we may hoard food, and the scarcity behind that, when you talk about the Minnesota starvation experiment, how sometimes knowing that people who experience any sort of deprivation will respond by overeating. When you tell someone that, it's like, oh, okay, well, that suddenly it makes the behavior okay. Like there's something about having a reason behind something. And so is I think there's reasons why greed would present itself as greed, as greed. I'm going to make a sweeping statement here. I don't know that any greed isn't rooted in some kind of psychological or biological rationale, that there's something that gave rise to the need for that thing, or the belief that we needed to have so much of it. And I think for me, that takes the onus off of the characterization of that, like of absorbing that as your flaw, that you're bad. That I think that there's, when it comes to food, even when it comes to money, when it comes to any vice that we're excessive with, that there's something that it's serving underneath that is propelling that to exist, and then it's not just simply, maybe that's, I don't know. What do you think of that? Are you in agreement?
I am. And I think that exactly that, when people have reasons, perhaps that does loosen it up a bit. But they've been believing the way they've been thinking for many years. And then they come in and they have a new reason offered to them. And they go, yes, yes, I think that's the thing
Mm,
that's happening for me. There's the release.
mhm.
But that old thinking is quite compelling, and it takes a bad day, it takes tiredness, it takes a certain emotional state when all that old thinking comes back again. What if I was just kidding myself
Yes.
about that thing that I believed, that actually this is a biological response to restriction? What if I'm kidding myself? Because look at that person over there on Instagram who is doing it.
Mhm.
We see all this contradictory evidence all the time, which
Yes.
can just trigger off those old beliefs again. So this is the journey, right?
Yes. I relate to that entirely. But it goes back to more reasoning, because it's like, well, the reason that someone like the counter theory. So it's like you get a reason, you absorb it as, okay, there's an explanation for being this way. It's not just that I'm this way. And then you find a way to change that story and say, but here's evidence of something else. But that thing has a reason. Like I think that it's it's too simplified to just say this reason doesn't exist in any sort of true capacity, and it's just that I'm greedy. That's a story that someone told you and you inherited about yourself, or maybe that you developed. I think usually these stories are passed to us, and there's nothing under that. It's just there's no investigation further, and I think that we owe it to ourselves to have more investigation. I think it's too easy to just call yourself something, including another word like this is lazy, that people will call themselves lazy. And I think there's so much under lazy that I don't know that you could just characterize someone as that. There's more going on that would cause someone to appear lazy. And I think we can look at that twice when we're tempted to just disregard that and go back to the old narrative of saying, but how does that narrative actually make sense where some other explanations don't? Like this, it doesn't make sense. There's nothing more to say except to call someone something or to call yourself something. That's where that story ends. There's no substance to it. It's simply just it's a throwing off of a categorization of self as a way to escape.
But not everyone believes that there is something underneath that.
Yeah.
So there are people who are like, well, I just feel like all these other reasons sound like excuses to me. Exactly. I'm just making excuses for myself. I'm just letting myself off the hook. I'm just justifying this unjustifiable behavior. People don't trust.
Yes, I know. And I fundamentally believe in reasons. And I think that's why I've always enjoyed therapy. It's because when you start to look at something, there's so much under the surface, and there's so much that makes sense. And I think it's worth looking at all the time. I think that we can always look a little deeper at something, because to not do that is to assume that everything is, well, I don't know. I guess some things can simply be true, but my brain doesn't work in the way of just accepting something at surface value. I really believe that there are reasons for pretty much everything. And maybe that's helpful to me, because I do believe in that. And I also respect that some people may not believe that. But I do. And so I think that if we look, that there's, I don't know, it feels like it makes sense to me.
What about then when people are in that conflicted place where they know with their rational mind that this is probably true, that there are these other reasons going on, that this is a problem, but they feel something different? I think sometimes having a reason can be really liberating, but also sometimes that rationalization isn't enough to make what feels true go away.
Yes. So this is that intellect versus emotion. And I think that we have to integrate them both. I think that to use an intellectual reason, it's not enough if it's not tapping into your emotional acceptance, right? That they're going to coexist. And that's why I think sometimes even with body image, we will understand that our worth is not our weight, but the emotional piece is saying something differently. It's not quite wrapping its head around it. It's like, I know that, but I don't feel that. And this is where I think the emotional pull of something, convincing you of something that you intellectually can invalidate, is usually more tied to a story. It's more tied to a belief that you have somewhere along the line inherited about yourself that taps into your own insecurities about yourself. And we hold on to it because I think that to release it would be like releasing a defense mechanism. So if we don't hold on to something, then we're going to be more vulnerable in case because maybe somebody else taught us this about ourselves. And that means somebody else might see that in us and call that out as well. So we need to hold on to that story so that we know it first and we can own it first, and then nobody else can come in and just and kind of like rock our world about it, like that no one can hurt us in that way again. Am I projecting?
We're always projecting, Stef.
But that, if you know it about yourself first, then no one can hurt you with that information. And so I think sometimes we are trying to hold on to that emotional insecurity as a way of protecting ourselves because somebody may have noticed something else about us before, and that stands to reason then that somebody else might again. And I think to separate ourselves from, or to call awareness that might be going on, that there might be some reason that our emotions are holding on to a story that is serving a purpose, and being able to say, oh, okay, I can see that might be happening here. And in that awareness, we're not buying into it entirely.
Yeah, I think the whole, I want to say the goal, but in some ways, the goal of this process is to be able to hold competing beliefs. I
Mm.
think when you can recognize that I know that this thing isn't true, but it still feels like it's true. And just be able to accept that dissonance, which I think is such a part of being human. I think when we don't fight against that process, it
Mm.
starts to move and loosen up. Otherwise, yes, I know that that's true, but I can't actually incorporate. Okay, can we just stay in that discomfort of knowing this thing is true,
Mm-hmm.
yet it doesn't feel true?
Mm-hmm.
Can we stay there? Because the mind just wants to go back and normally reverts to how we feel. I think generally, not always, but I think for a lot of people, especially who struggle with food, this is
Yeah.
happening in the emotional realm. I think when we recognize that that's going on, and hopefully by us talking about it, people can realize that this is normal as well.
Mhm.
Because we see it with the anti-diet, people will people, I always say people to talk about the whole world.
Message.
I'm going to say people will think that like, yes, it's brilliant, it's worthwhile, like I think these people look amazing, but I can't I can't experience that for myself. And so then they feel like they are a bad anti-dieter because they can't fully feel the truth of that, even if they mentally can accept the truth of that.
Mm-hmm. We hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast. We just want to take a minute of your time to let you know we're now on Patreon. If you would like to support our work and be a part of our growing community, please head to patreon.com/Life After Diets.
All of our patrons are invited to join us in our Life After Diets private Facebook group to connect with us and other like-minded souls. For more details about how to contact us or to work with Sarah or Stef individually, please check out the show notes. Now let's get back to the episode.
I think another reason that people feel greedy, especially coming from the anti-diet space, is that, well, I've tried allowing myself um, to eat all foods, and it doesn't end. I still want all the foods all the time, and that becomes evidence of greed because according to the philosophy of anti-diet, when we give ourselves permission to eat food, we should evolve into a place where we no longer want that. And when that's not happening, what are we left with except to assume, well, I'm just greedy, or I'm broken around food, or I'm addicted to it, or whatever it might be. What do you say to that? Like, what now? When you get to that space, I think that's where the word greed will pop up.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've done quite a few posts around this subject, and I think you talked to it very well around you can be physically done with food, but not emotionally done with food. And it does, for me, it brings up this common theme that I'm seeing, that people are really judging their emotions. They have these beliefs about how they should feel, what they should want, what they desire, why they desire it. And it comes back to these stories again, the stories that we tell ourselves about what it means to want more, what it means to feel angry or sad or jealous or shame. All of these feelings come with these big stories, these whole complex web of beliefs about who we are, just because we're experiencing an emotion. We make it mean a lot.
Greed in response, like when you give yourself permission to eat and you keep eating. And I think to tie the emotions into that is appropriate, because when food and emotions are wrapped together, which they often are, and when our emotional needs or our emotions are unable to be satisfied, or they seem unending, and we're using food as a way of pushing those down, distracting from them, then it becomes about satiation of emotions, which isn't there. Like, it's if an emotion consistently needs to be pushed down and pushed away or disregarded or ignored, and we're using food to do that, then the food will seem like it's unending, the unending desire to keep pushing away. Is it really that we're after the food here? Are we greedy for food, or are we greedy for the emotional suppression? And it's like, when we're not able to make peace with an emotion in some way, then food will continue to be, it'll be a bottomless pit of needing to push it down, because the emotion will not just simply dissolve.
Mhm.
So looking at it as food being just a vehicle for something else that might be too much, or feel like it's too much, or feel like if we let it out, it wouldn't stop. Which can often be the case I find with people who struggle with food and with body image, that very lean towards more sensitivity, that there is more of an acute emotional awareness, or a highly sensitive people. And it's not valued in our culture to be sensitive. So having depth of emotion and a big emotional range is not well received. It's not strong. It's not valuable. And in the suppression of that tends to grow, because if there's a scarcity of feeling like those needs are being seen and met and validated, there will be more of a tendency to cling to them and have them, and they grow and grow. It's this relationship between scarcity and greed, I think, is significant, and it's meaningful here. I think the scarcity comes first.
Then someone might judge themselves though and say, well, why can't I deal with my emotions? Why aren't other people doing this when it comes to their feelings? It can look like everybody else is so great at handling their feelings. And I don't know if you've ever seen this in the binge eating literature, but they talk about people who struggle with binge eating having a low tolerance for discomfort.
Yes.
Which really grinds my gears. But I think then people believe that about themselves. That's another way that they make themselves wrong. To that, I always say, I actually don't think that that's true at all. I just think that these beliefs and these emotions are almost like this catalyst, particularly around food, where the brain has associated food with safety, or it's associated food with coping or feeling calmer, whatever that might be. But I actually suspect that people who struggle with binge eating experience a lot more emotional discomfort than someone else who's not using some other kind of coping mechanism. I'm not want to compare it to other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I also think that there's different levels of there's a different emotional ranges that we have. I think some people are more um, live in an intellectual space, and some people live in a more emotional space, or they tap into that more. I think there's difference in sensitivity levels among humans. Many of clients I have that learn about being a highly sensitive person, or who hear that it's, or understand that it's just not a valued characteristic of our culture, feel so much relief when they hear that it might not be that they are inherently flawed, but that they live in a culture that doesn't allow it. I think we have different capacities for sensitivity. I think that in the way that Myers-Briggs can say there's different types of personalities and different types of moving through the world intellectually and emotionally, that there's different levels of sensitivity. And for someone who is always being stimulated by their environment or by things people are saying, and they're taking it in differently than someone else, that there is more of a vulnerability there for emotions, and that isn't held in our world as readily as intellect and strength and pushing, and that if your way of being is not validated, then you're going to feel broken and wrong. You're going to feel like it's you, because you are going against the cultural grain. When in fact, I think there's many people who exist in this capacity. And it's like being a woman versus a man. Like, which one is valued more? Which one has a story attached to it differently? It's not a right or wrong issue. It's which one is given more validation.
Mm-hmm. And to me, I really resonate with the idea that certain emotional pain, we transform it through the binge eating. So whatever it is that's going on, we experience it as a strong urge to binge, we binge, and now we can release our pain through self-disgust, physical discomfort, shame, all of those other kinds of feelings. And so people will sometimes say, oh, I binge because I can't cope with my emotions. They are feeling a lot. It's not they're not feeling, it's coming after the binge for them, because there's almost this transformation process that can take place in the act of eating. This is not going to resonate with everybody. But now, if the problem was I'm feeling lonely And so I binge. Now the problem is I've binged and my body's wrong and I'm out of control. But what I've done is I've made me the problem. And that's actually the hopeful state, because if the problem is out there, if the world's the problem, we're not in control of that. But if we make ourselves the problem, we have a purpose to fix ourselves, then that, I think, can be a way of processing emotions about things that are out of our control. It feels like a way to take control.
Absolutely. And I think that when you're talking about greed, right? And I think that in some ways there's an energy of that. There's like the more we have energy around food, the more that might show up as excess and the binge behavior. And when we're talking about emotions, that is also energy. And that is, I think, for anyone experiencing emotions to a degree, that there's a heightened amount of energy that needs to be translated somewhere. And that may come through a binge. And I think that, yeah, I don't know what I think. That's what I was trying to say. Forget it. Just erase that entire part.
Oh, but it was so good.
Oh.
We could just leave this bit in.
Why not? So if we've got heightened emotions, then we've got heightened energy, and a binge is a translation of that energy. And I think that that's how all of this can tie together, and we can see it as greed when it is sort of a manifestation of having energy around something.
Yeah. So you're preaching to the choir there, because I never think things are as simple as what they seem. I think we are so complicated and we have layers and layers, but there are certain ways of thinking out there that see it as almost self-indulgent, like navel gazing is one of the things that's often said about this kind of work, where we're going inside and really trying to understand ourselves. And so guilt comes into that. When we have a problem that seems to take over everything, when we're spending most of our waking time thinking about food, we are not able to think about other things. And that affects the way that we operate in the world, and then affects the way that people respond to us. And then that increases another layer of we are somehow wrong. The amount of times people will say that it's shallow or vain or selfish, or this is a self-indulgence thing. That word indulgence comes in. And I don't know about you, Steph, but binge eating never felt like an indulgence to me.
Well, it also brings to mind, just because something can be explained or there's a reason behind something, it's almost like that conversation of intent versus impact. Like there might be an intent that is real, the same way there might be an explanation that is real, but does that ultimately mean that the impact of that or the resulting behaviors that happen are excusable? You know, that we have this idea that, okay, yeah, there's a reason I'm like this, but at the end of the day, does it matter because I'm ultimately suffering, or I'm ultimately making others feeling like I'm making others suffer for this? And I think that's like, yes, of course, we can hold both sides of this, and it's not to say that understanding something excuses something or that it's all that matters, but that there are other layers of looking at something where we tend to be looking at it very black and white as I'm just bad and I'm just greedy and that's just what it is. And it's kind of like an offering of, hold on a minute. There's reasons this is existing. Is it okay with you that it exists? No. Are there ways that we want to help us through this? We don't just stop at the explanation, but it does offer nuance to the conversation rather than just offering oneself a dejection, and leaving it there. And that's all that matters. That's only half of the story too, like the end results or the ultimate behavior. We have to look at this thing in a more holistic way, which isn't to say that either one side, the explanation or the result, holds all of the power or gets to run the show. It's just a matter of looking at this in a more complex way, which lends itself to compassion, which ultimately helps the behavior.
I see all of this kind of work as working on our relationship with ourselves. And it, always makes me think of that really cliched analogy. You put your oxygen mask on first before you help anyone else. Because ultimately, and this is my personal philosophy, that when I take care of myself and I pay attention to myself and I take time and energy to connect with myself, I can connect better with others. I'm actually freer to navigate the world and interact with people in a more present, and I want to say loving way. That was the word that came to mind. And yet I see so many struggling with this idea of putting themselves first. I don't know if you get this, Steph, but sometimes someone will come to work with me and they're like, I've got this 50 minutes a week and that's it. There's no time, no space between sessions to be with this and to digest this and to play with these ideas. It's not possible to make much progress if you're just giving yourself those 50 minutes a week. And yet, so many are reluctant to make that time for themselves. And why do you think people find it so difficult to prioritize themselves?
Scarcity. I think there's a real lack of time in this world. I think that there's a lot of pressure to be performing and producing and serving. I know that as a mom, I have sometimes felt that way, where I literally don't have time to stop. Like there's just not any. And to prioritize that is to just it's an interruption of a flow that's already established. It's like breaking momentum, and it can feel like I can't stop long enough to disrupt. It would be a disruption in a way, and I think that is ultimately what it comes down to. I think I've had to disrupt my flow in order to prioritize myself on purpose, but it's certainly not the path of least resistance. And just I think habit and perhaps fear of stopping and looking. And so to create time for more discomfort may not be so appealing.
Especially if we can't find that curiosity and compassion, because that critical voice for some people fires up the minute they stop and look at what's going on for themselves. So yeah, that just brings us back around to compassion. Episode 5, you can check that one out there. And do you know what I'm greedy for these days?
Ratings and reviews.
I tried to change the tone of my voice and I couldn't. I could just feel myself grinning at you. And I was like, I couldn't weave it in.
That's okay. Nice ladies.
Worth a listen.
Worth a listen. 5 stars.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Have a great day.
See you next time.
Bye.